firm against further expansion of influence for a very small minority of very wealthy individuals. That's not enough. I hope the Supreme Court does the right thing today. But there is more that needs to be done. Senator Sanders and I have moved forward the Democracy is for People Amendment to roll back Citizens United, to push back against the arguments made. To push back against the arguments made by some of the justices today that if there are no limits on contributions to committees, why should there be any limits on contributions to candidates? The answer is clear, because the best thing that we can do to restore faith in American democracy, to ensure that the agenda in Washington is set by the men and women who can vote in our elections, is to make sure, one, that the only people who can contribute to our campaigns are citizens and not corporations, and to make sure that the power of a very small minority cannot trump the power of the American people to restore our democracy. That's what's at stake. This cause is great. It is the most important thing we can do to, again, restore American democracy. The American people look at Washington, especially today, and they ask how it is we've gotten to this place. Why aren't their voices listened to? Why don't they matter? The reason that we will make sure they matter is when we amend the Constitution to overturn Citizens United and give the American democracy back to our people. That's what we intend to do. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Okay, give it up again for Representative Deutsch. A little brief pause. We're not taking a brief pause. Okay, let me introduce a real hero of mine, Liz Kennedy from Demos, who's just awesome spirit in this movement. Liz.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for being out here this afternoon, this morning. I just got out of the courtroom where we heard an excellent defense of these incredibly important aggregate contribution limits, these common sense contribution limits that we need to protect our democratic government from capture by big, concentrated private economic forces. And one thing that some of the justices really correctly focused on in the oral argument is that right now, too many of the American people, a majority, believe that their elected representatives are more responsive to their big donors than to voters or even the public interest. That is not a situation that leads us to a healthy democracy, and that is not a situation that we should accept. We absolutely need to stand up and tell our court and our elected representatives that now is the time to start taking our government back from the forces of big money that are dominating our politics and our policies. We have 8 in 10 Americans that understand that campaign contributions are blocking progress on the issues that are important to all of us, such as upward mobility issues, responding to climate change. We see the same enemies of our right to have our own voices heard by our elected representatives, the folks who are trying to deprive us of any number of common sense protections for rules on money and politics, and who have already done such a great job of removing the protections, for example, against corporations spending directly from their treasuries to influence our elections, which we saw in Citizens United. So many of the same folks that are bankrolling this attack on our money and politics rules are also attacking our voting rights rules. So many of the same folks that are funding the shutdown, the support for the shutdown of the government, are also the folks funding our elections and then personally benefiting from the rules that get made. They are continuing to engage in destructive business practices when, for example, financialization, because we haven't been able to have successful, effective financial reform, business practices are extracting the wealth from our communities that we need, Americans need at home. These folks are personally benefiting from the attack on our environmental laws. Congress has taken 300 votes attacking clean water and clean air laws. Sean McCutcheon, who has just as much of a right to spend within normal limits as any of us, but instead wants to be able to spend up to more than $123,000, as you've heard, which I'm sure you know is more than twice the average American's household income. That is not the kind of democracy that we need, and that is not the kind of government that is going to, really have us live up to our democratic values, where the size of a citizen's wallet does not determine the impact of their voice or their right to representation. So Justice Kagan definitely had great things to say. I can report where when certain members of the court were concerned that, well, gee, now that all of this money is coming in with independent expenditures, well, gee, maybe we should get rid of the aggregate contribution limits so that there's just tons of money everywhere. Kagan suggested that if the court was re-examining their concerns about the corrupting influence of independent expenditures, perhaps the court should revisit the Citizens United decision rather than striking down these necessary protections of the McCutcheon decision. I look forward to taking this to Congress and continuing the fight to protect our democracy. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. We want to thank you again for coming today. We may have a few more folks who are inside the court coming out to speak, but I did want to take this opportunity to emphasize again that the difference between today and 4 years ago in Citizens United is everyone who's standing right here. It's the reporters who are here telling this story, and it's the people who are rallying all across the country to let the Supreme Court know that we understand what corruption really looks like. We understand after the 2012 elections that when a small handful of individuals are responsible for the majority of funds in super PACs, that we have a problem, that is what corruption looks like, and we can stop this now. So, standing with us, talking about how these issues affect you and the issues that you care about most are the most important things we can do now. There are a range of solutions that, regardless of what the court does here today, Congress across the street should be doing now. Passing a constitutional amendment to undo what the court has already done. Passing public financing to empower everyday Americans to fund our elections. Passing disclosure laws so we know who is trying to influence our votes, and making sure that it's shareholders who decide if and when their money is used in elections. We're going to be going across the street in about an hour and talking to the members of Congress who are still on the Hill, because the people will not be shut down, and this needs to be heard today. I'm happy to announce that right now we'll be hearing from Fred Wertheimer, who is a veteran of the campaign finance reform movement. And here he comes. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks everyone for being here. This is a profoundly important case. It goes to the heart of whether big money can corrupt government decisions. For 40 years, the Supreme Court has upheld limits on contributions to candidates and parties. That is the issue at stake in this case. This is not about whether an individual can give a few more contributions to a few more candidates. It's about whether a powerful federal office holder can solicit a $1 million, a $2 million, as much as $3.5 million contribution. That act of solicitation and giving creates the opportunities for corruption that the court has repeatedly said can be limited. there is no basis for this court to strike down the contribution limits based on its decisions for the past 40 years. The reality is that it is this court that drew the line between independent expenditures, which they said do not pose risks of corruption, and contribution limits that they have accepted do create the risk of corruption. That's the issue in this case. The issue in this case has nothing to do with outside spending or the problems the Supreme Court has created in Citizens United. The issue in this case is whether relatively few people are going to be given new rights to corrupt our government decisions and federal office holders. Understand that there were about 1,570 individuals who gave the maximum amount to parties in the last election. There were about 600 who gave the maximum amount to candidates. So we're dealing with maybe 2,500 at most individuals who gave the maximum amount in the past and who are now, in essence, asking to be able to give $1 million and $2 million contributions. There is no question that if the court were to strike down these limits, $1 million and $2 million contributions will follow, and government corruption will follow as sure as we're standing here. So we have a very important case pending before this court, and we will have to see what happens. But as we know, in any event, our fight goes forward. Regardless of what happened in Citizens United, regardless of what happens in this case, there is a rapidly growing national campaign finance reform movement in this country. There are reforms that can be effective, that can counter big money in politics. We know them. They include disclosure, they include public financing, they include limiting curbs on PACs, on independent spending PACs in ways that we can within the Supreme Court decision. They include changing the Citizens United decision, whether it's done by contribution, by constitutional amendment, or whether it's done by having this court change and starting with a new approach. There are reforms that lie ahead. We will not accept the corruption of our government by wealthy individuals or corporations. The country won't accept it. The country objects to it. So our fight goes on regardless of what happens here. But there is no basis in this case for the Supreme Court striking down this protection against corruption. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fred. And now I'd like to introduce Tara Malloy, who is Senior Counsel of the Campaign Legal Center. Tara, thank you for joining us.
I am a senior counsel at the Campaign Legal Center, one of the groups that filed a front of the court brief and many courts briefs before the Supreme Court urging them to uphold the type of protections on campaign spending that we see today. I would just like to say that it's extraordinary to me that I am standing on the steps of the Supreme Court and we are actually debating whether or not a $3.5 million contribution to a single party is somehow corruptive. How have we come to the point that millions of dollars can be given by a single individual and 9 justices can't make up their minds about whether or not that is detrimental to the integrity of our election? What was amazing is that there was no dispute about how much money could be contributed in the absence of the aggregate limits. If the aggregate limits were struck down, a single person could give over $1 million to their party of choice. A single person could give another $2 million to the candidates of the party of their choice. And nobody disputed that in there. So it's amazing to me that this is somehow controversial, that we should try to limit this type of massive spending. And you know what? Until that a couple of years ago, this wasn't controversial. Many speakers have probably mentioned that this very court upheld almost this exact aggregate limit 40 years ago in Buckley v. Vallejo. We are talking about settled law. We are talking about expectations that everyone has had for the integrity of our democracy. And yet now suddenly this court is willing to overturn yet another case in order to free up the very small amount of mega donors to give even more to our elections. So I think we have to be clear. We're not talking about whether someone can contribute a small amount. We're talking about whether someone has to contribute more than $100,000 to candidates in a single election cycle. And until very recently, this court was not disputing the question of whether or not we needed such protections on our democracy. And I certainly hope, as a lawyer with the Campaign Legal Center, that the Supreme Court doesn't disappoint us again and overrule its precedents like it did in Citizens United. So we certainly hope that everyone keeps the faith and that this court can be persuaded to be as judicially restrained as it has always promised to be. Thank you.
So I wanted to thank everyone for being here. Thank you all. Remember that our democracy is not for sale. Thank you. We both want to thank you so much for spending the morning here. Our democracy is not for sale.